All right, Joseph Stalzi is a research associate with the Soufan Center think tank. He served as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Army. Joseph, thanks so much for talking to us.
Yeah, happy to be with you, Dana. As you mentioned, I'm with the Soufan Center. I have to say up front that all my views are my own, not necessarily those of the Soufan Center, but really pleased to be with you and excited to
That's
talk
the
about.
caveat, and say in case you say something stupid. I understand,
Oh
but
yeah,
I
got
know
to get
you
it in
won't.
up front.
I know you won't, and I know all of the people at the Soufan. And for people that don't know the Soufan Center, it is just full of really some terrific people on terrorism issues, on anything geopolitical. I have huge respect for the Soufan Center. So look, a lot has been happening in Ukraine in the last 24, 48, 72 hours, and even less than that today. But
Yeah.
Russia has been hammering Ukraine with dozens of missiles. Many of them intercepted. Right now, we're hearing that at least 50 cruise missiles were fired. Is this, in your view, is this punishment, or does it have a tactical purpose?
I don't necessarily think that they're different from one another in the Russians' eyes. I think that the Russians through this war have been frustrated. They've shown a complete inability to execute combined arms maneuver. And this has resulted in some very embarrassing battlefield setbacks and collapses. And this is them reaching to an old tactic, which they proved in Syria, and it's entirely designed to, as you mentioned, punish the Ukrainian population, but that serves a dual purpose because not only does it psychologically terrorize the population, but it also, in their hopes, erodes popular support for the war effort and potentially pushes President Zelensky to the negotiating table. I don't think that's going to happen, but I believe that is the intent behind these kinds of attacks.
Analysts keep telling us that Russia's running out of missiles, and that some of the bans on imports would prevent Russia from restocking its supply, and that it could take years for it to catch up, not a matter of months. But I mean, every time they say that, you see these incredible numbers of attacks, which took place after the Crimea bridge was attacked, and it was a daily volley of missiles from Russia and drones, just not all missiles, but drones as well. And today, 50 missiles fired. It sure doesn't seem like they're running out of anything.
Well, I do think they are running out of these missiles, and we see that by nature of the fact that they are now purchasing ballistic missiles from Iran. Recently they completed arms sales with Iran. They purchased two separate systems of drones, two separate types of ballistic missiles, and those are what we're seeing in these attacks. There may be some Russian cruise missiles interspersed within those attacks, but by and large, they're now relying on imported Iranian weapons, and their industrial military complex is unable to keep up with the pace of the fighting in Ukraine.
So what would you say about the timing of this? I mean, it comes right after the attack, these waterborne drone attacks, which
Yeah.
took place in Sevastopol harbor over the weekend. It's probably, the Russians never want to talk about damage to warships, but I mean, they never told us that the Moskva sank until many
Right.
weeks later. Now you have reports from the Ukrainian side that probably it damaged a Russian frigate, maybe a minesweeper. In terms of military strategy and tactics, some people are saying that this is history making, the use of these waterborne drones by the Ukrainians.
It certainly is. I think that the unmanned systems are not new. They've been around for a long time. However, we're getting better at using them, and the Ukrainians are really leading in this effort. Uh, they've been very ingenious in their implementation of these kinds of systems. And we've seen that with unmanned aerial systems as well as these uncrewed surface vessels, as you mentioned, and they're having an impact. It may not, it's too early to tell what the battle damage assessment was from these attacks. psychological impact as well, not only on the Russian, Black Sea Fleet, but also for the Ukrainian population. And when the Ukrainian military is able to use these very cost-effective systems to enable deep strikes within the Russian support zone, it boosts the morale of the Ukrainian people. And I can imagine they may need it right now after the series of attacks that have targeted Ukrainian cities, producing blackouts, and now I'm hearing water shortages. So I imagine it's quite effective, maybe not from a direct military perspective, but absolutely from a morale and psychological perspective.
Yeah, and it's important to keep in mind while there's damage to a couple of warships. In fact, the Ukrainian cities are being hammered for 8 months now, and you make that point, and I appreciate that. The former Lieutenant Army Commander in Europe, retired Ben Hodges, he responded on Twitter, and I know Ben quite well, but he said, when the Russian Ministry of Defense came out and said massive attacks using these waterborne drones, he said massive. It's like wait till you see the HIMARS get in range of Crimea, then you'll see massive. Do you think that that's coming, and how the Russians will be able to react to that? That will be a much more serious chapter in this conflict if Ukraine is able to bring direct fire onto the Crimea, the illegally annexed peninsula that was taken by the Russians in 2014.
I do think it's coming. I think as the Ukrainian advance around Kherson progresses, those systems will come within range of Crimea. Obviously, it is a statement move to attack the Russian occupied Crimea with artillery systems like the HIMARS. But so far, President Zelensky and his staff have shown a willingness to bring the war to Crimea. We've seen the attack on the Kerch Bridge Strait. We've seen the attack on the Saki Air Base earlier in the summer. And I see no reason why he would stop at launching those kinds of attacks. Although they've been cagey about admitting responsibility for them, it would be militarily very effective to jeopardize the supply and logistics bases that the Russians have in Crimea. And it would really be destabilizing for their defense of southern Ukraine.
What kind of a fight do you think is waiting for the Ukrainians right now as they close in around Kherson? I mean, you were in Iraq, and U.S. forces who were very good, certainly had their challenges in these urban environments. When you have to go, and I followed them as a reporter, going, door to door, house by house, room by room. It's incredibly exhausting, time consuming. I mean, and it sounds like the Russians are ready for an urban warfare fight in Kherson.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting question. So I think if you ask the Russian generals, they want nothing to do with that. The problem is that Putin's political aims do not align with the Russian generals' preference to withdraw from Kherson to the eastern side of the river. So I do believe that there's a possibility that this could devolve into some very, very brutal, house-to-house fighting in Kherson. One alternative to that is if the Ukrainians are able to move their artillery systems to within range of the supply lines that are feeding Russian defenders in Kherson. If they're able to successfully interdict those supply lines, I think even to President Putin, it will be clear that the defense of Kherson is untenable, and he may authorize a withdrawal. But it's hard to predict right now.
Joseph, will you talk to the export grain deal that Russia has now backed out of? So the ships that are leaving Odessa carrying grain for hungry countries were at first cut off, and now Turkey, working with the UN, is escorting some of those ships as we speak. And it seems like this operation is fraught with potential crisis. And now the Kremlin says, quote unquote, it's risky for Ukraine to export grain through the Black Sea. Russian spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters this morning that the deal is now hardly feasible and takes on a very different character, much more risky, dangerous, and unguaranteed. I mean, that sounds like a proverbial shot over the bow right away.
Yeah, certainly menacing rhetoric. So yeah, the Russians withdrew from this deal in response to the, as they described it, massive attack on the Black Sea fleet. And right now, the grain shipments are going ahead. However, the Russians could decide to step in at any time to intercept them and prevent them from arriving at their destination. So I don't think they're going to do that.
And they may not do so openly. They may do so from the shadows or with a mine or with a submarine. There's a lot of different ways that they can cause havoc with those ships that, by the way, rely on private insurance companies to insure them, unless the UN's guaranteeing the value of those shipping companies.
Right. You're absolutely right. They could do that. I think there's also a possibility that they will cite some sort of trumped up provocation, inventing a story that the Ukrainians are using these ships to smuggle nefarious goods out of the country or into the country. And that would be used as justification for intercepting the ships. But I think that that's a possibility. I think it's the next step in an escalatory ladder that the Russians have proven very willing to climb. And the tragedy is that this is problematic for of course the Ukrainian grain markets, absolutely, but also a lot of people in the Middle East and Africa who depend on Ukrainian grain imports. And even with the specter of this possibility out there, I think we're gonna see rises in food prices and an increase in food security as a result of this Russian withdrawal.
It would have been probably more risky if NATO had said that they would escort those ships. It's not NATO. This is a UN operation backed by Turkey. And President Erdogan has been pretty adept at walking this tightrope between his responsibility as a member of NATO, pleasing his Western allies, not all the time, and at the same time, he's kept an open dialogue with President Putin and Russia. It becomes tricky for the Russians to mess around with these convoys that are Turkish ship led and being guarded to some extent.
That's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. They would have to be very, very careful in how they went about intercepting them, because the repercussions could be enormous if they were to go about it in the wrong way. So it's definitely something that they will be careful in approaching if they do deem to intercept this traffic.
All right, you're a former intelligence guy, and I know you guys like to look at and analyze and reflect. Tell me, just the last question to you: how do you think that this is going to go? I mean, because there's a lot of positive spin on Ukraine's advancement on the battlefield, because by them trumpeting that as loud as they can, that keeps the West from being divided. It stops some of the voices that are calling for them to go back to the negotiating table now and come up with some kind of ceasefire and some kind of negotiated resolution. If they can show progress, then people are willing to wait to some degree. It also justifies all of the arms that are coming from the West and the billions of dollars in expenditures. I mean, what is your assessment? Are we putting too positive a spin on how the Ukrainians are doing, or how do you think this is going to play out in the next few months?
I think there's no denying that we are looking at this through a Western lens. We're only seeing part of the picture, but I think that's important to acknowledge. But I also think it's it's something that we have to understand. But going into the winter, I think that Ukraine and the Ukrainian government is going to continue trying to boost its population's morale And it's going to prove its will to fight, to reassure its Western supporters as well, and keep those arms shipments coming by launching attacks like the one we saw in the Black Sea Fleet, for instance. This, coupled with steady gains in offensives around Kherson, are going to be very important as we go into what could be a very long winter. And we can already see signs that Ukrainian civilians are going to be tested. So these kinds of reassuring, battlefield successes are going to be very important to civilian morale. But it's also important to remember that this is Putin's point of maximum leverage over Europe in terms of energy. After this winter, energy diversification will be fully underway, and Russia will no longer have the hold it currently does over European energy markets. I think going forward, Russia will continue to target civilian infrastructure while trying to stabilize their front lines with the newly arrived conscripts that they've filled their ranks out with through mobilization. But without the proper equipment, not only for just general offensive warfare, but also for winter warfare, it's really unlikely that the Russians are going to go back on the offensive anytime soon. Ukraine, however, will likely continue to press its advantage. The winter conditions will absolutely slow things down, but the fighting will continue, and it's in Ukraine's interest to press its advantage as long as it can. Battlefield victories can go a long way to motivating a civilian population living without essential services and enduring regular air raids.
Joseph Stalzi with the Soufan Center. Joseph, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.